Welcome to our webinar. I am April Barton. I am the very proud Dean of Duquesne University's Thomas R. Klein School of Law. Welcome to our webinar event, Building Belonging Through Radical Empathy, a conversation with esteemed author Terri Givens. I am so honored to be here and welcome all of you. I want you to know how grateful I am that you are all here with us having this important dialogue. I will just say that here at Duquesne University, we are grounded in our spirit and mission. And this mission, when I think about it, it guides us to carry ourselves with humility, with integrity, with authenticity, and open ourselves to the lived experiences of others. But just having this mission is not enough. Creating a culture requires action. It requires us to constantly check in and to challenge ourselves and to engage in brave conversations, just like we are today around empathy. It requires us to teach ourselves how to better understand the lived experiences of others so that ultimately we can go out and we can improve the human condition and bring about much needed change and healing to our society. I can tell you with utmost confidence that this generation of future lawyers look for leaders who lead with empathy. And I have seen this firsthand repeatedly in our leadership classes when I ask students about the qualities that are most important in a great leader. The characteristics that are most cited are compassion and empathy, even vulnerability, really understanding and listening to others. And this gives me such hope for our future because I know that this generation understands innately that in order to build communities of belonging, that we must appreciate the ways in which people's personal experiences are unique and differ from our own. We must also honor and respect and celebrate this. And so we need to have courageous conversations like we are today, where we continue to reinforce and challenge ourselves to build our empathy muscles. So I am so eager to listen and learn from our amazing speaker and our panelists today. I am now going to hand it off to our inaugural Chief Diversity Officer, whose presence has been truly transformative. We are so lucky to have her wisdom, her energy, and her leadership here at Duquesne University, Crystal McCormick-Ware.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Duquesne University as we celebrate Black History Month with the theme for 2023, Black Resistance. For those who are new to Duquesne, I would like to introduce you to who we are. At Duquesne University, we have a strong commitment to diversity and believe in equity and the opportunity, and that both begin at home. Our commitment to diversity is seen every day in our community of nearly 9,500 students, representing every state in 80 plus countries, and a broad range of diverse backgrounds and experiences. At the same time, we are small enough that faculty, staff, and students know one another by name and are invested in each other's success. We realize that a diverse student population is important in advancing our mission, as Dean Barton mentioned, and Duquesne students are individuals with their own stories, interests, backgrounds, and dreams. This diversity of experiences enriches our campus culture and provides countless opportunities for our students in the 9 schools and soon to be 10 schools to find their paths and connect with a variety of people who share their passions. At Duquesne, we recognize and value in teaching our students to embrace diversity in the work that they do as well. This appreciation of different backgrounds, beliefs, and talents produces students who are sought after by organizations for their ability to lead and collaborate in the global community. I am very pleased to introduce Terri Givens. Terri is the author of the book Radical Empathy, which we will be featuring today, Finding a Path for Bridging Racial Divides. Beyond radical empathy, she is the author of many books and articles on immigration policy, anti-discrimination politics, and comparative politics. Here are several. The Roots of Racism, The Politics of White Supremacy in the United States and Europe, Immigration in the 21st Century, Voting Radically Right in the Western United States, Legislating equality, the politics of anti-discrimination in Europe. She is currently the professor of political science at McGill University and is the founder of the Center for Higher Education and Brighter Professional Development. She is also the provost academic lead and advisor on McGill's strategy to address anti-racism, anti-Black racism. So she is actually applying all of her radical empathy practices into McGill as they move on with their anti-racism platform. She's an accomplished speaker, author, consultant, and mentor. She is using her platform to develop leaders to understand the importance of diversity and encourage personal growth through empathy. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Terri Givens.
And of course, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much. This is such a pleasure for me to be here. And I want to thank everybody, particularly Dana and Yaksu, who invited me to do this. And it's really been wonderful connecting with the folks at Duquesne as somebody who has roots in Pittsburgh. I think it's really important that we make these connections, and I hope someday to actually be able to visit campus. So I just wanted to, start off with just a little blurb about, why I decided to write the book, and then I have some questions that we'll get into. But first, people always, when I do these talks, people always ask me, why this book? And I started this book long before George Floyd, the summer of George Floyd after his murder. This book came out of so many different influences in my life, including losing my father in 2001 from a heart attack. And, what spurred me on at that point was when I learned, doing some research into, heart attacks and heart disease, that just being an African-American male made you more likely to die from a heart attack or a first heart attack. And that just struck me as, really in the heart of how systemic racism impacts so many of us. And, I had what I call my man in the mirror moment, those of you who are Michael Jackson fans, when I realized, this was when I was still at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was thinking about leadership and so on. And I realized that, there's sometimes a disconnect between, what we do as individuals and what we think needs to be done at leadership levels. And so we're all can be leaders. And I realized, looking in the mirror, I can be a leader. But it takes me looking internally and understanding, what's important for me and how I can play a role in creating change. And so one of the things I did was I started an organization called Take Back the Trail. This was actually after my father died from a heart attack. My mother passed away after having a stroke. And I realized, health and fitness was a problem for the African-American community and also the Hispanic community in Austin, Texas. And so I decided at that point to, basically start a program called Take Back the Trail. So that really was something that was helpful to promote fitness and actually create change, as I like to say, with the 6 steps of radical empathy. So in any case, my first question, and Dana, were you going to ask the questions, or do you want me to just go ahead and answer them?
Actually, we have the amazing Quincy Stevenson, who is going to
yes. Okay.
And
go ahead, Quincy.
He's so much better than I am.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for that wonderful testimony. I was struck by the words that you just gave there in reference to the health problems in the Black and Brown community. In reference to the questions that we can get into, and just full disclosure, everyone, Dr. Givens has given me her permission to refer to her as Terri, so I want to put that out there. as well. Would you like for me to pull the slides up at this time?
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and start with the slide that explains the 6 steps, and then we can, because that will help me explain what radical empathy is.
Absolutely.
The reason I talk about radical empathy is because it goes beyond just empathy. So, it's in one of the steps is actually to practice empathy, because empathy isn't something that comes naturally to us. But radical empathy is actually a process of being able to move from, being, first of all, vulnerable and understanding who you are, and becoming grounded in who you are, so that you can be more open to understanding the experiences of others. And I really think that component of understanding who you are is important. And so I am going to go ahead and see if I can pull up this slide. Let me go ahead and share. And there we go. Now you should be able to see. What is radical empathy? There we go. Great. All right. So I'll go through this relatively quickly. So as I mentioned, the first step is a willingness to be vulnerable. The next is being grounded in who you are. Another song I love, Whitney Houston, learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all. But that also allows you to be open to the experiences of others, and then practicing empathy. And so, but the radical component of it is taking action and creating change and building trust. So I just wanted to make sure we got that out there, because that's sort of like the baseline for the book. And we need to understand that radical empathy is really about not just sitting back and saying, oh, I understand how you feel. It's about, I'm going to do something about this. And so, there's a lot of ways we can address this in the academic context. And one of the key things, as Dean Barton already mentioned, I'm doing this right now here at McGill. And, and so empathy for me really applies to the academy in so many ways. One of the things I like to talk about is that we tend to have a kind of a, fraternity hazing mentality in higher ed, that, it's who can survive. And the reality is everybody can survive if we all support each other, have empathy, work with each other. There's no reason this has to be a situation, it's not. One of the books I really love is Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, because she talks about this idea that, it's not just, if we all work together, it's not about just the individual. If we can think of each other as a community, if we can work with each other. And I think that is a change we need to make in the academy, in higher ed, to think of ourselves more as a community than as individuals who are all scrapping for, that last bit of pie. There's a big pie, we can all partake in it, and actually the pie gets bigger as we add to it.
Wonderful. When you consider radical empathy, you were just discussing how it can be applicable in academia. When you consider today's climate and what we're seeing in our world today, what are some of the gaps that come to your mind that radical empathy could fill?
Well, the first gap is just this, creating connections. One of the problems I see is that, the people who want to divide us are trying to dehumanize us. And it's a lot harder for your neighbor to dehumanize you if they know who you are. And, it's a really interesting phenomenon we've seen over time, that we become so much more individualized and atomized, is one of the terms we use. And one of my colleagues, Robert Putnam, wrote the book Bowling Alone a long time ago. Now we're all on our phones alone. And so what we need to do is start to make those connections, and we need to get out of our comfort zone to do that, because it's really easy. Our primal brains want to categorize people and say, well, this is somebody I can be with and this is somebody I can't be with. But the reality is that, we can be intentional and work past that and say, no, I'm going to be open to meeting this person who I may not have, you don't know if you have connections because, a lot of times that's why I talk about identity, because our identities are very complex. Nobody wants to be stereotyped or put into a particular box. We have very complex identities. I have so many different parts of me. I ran track. I loved reading books. I love science fiction. Those are some ways that I can connect with people that go beyond just, my skin color or my gender. And so it's really important that we think about, bridging. That's why I said, finding a way to bridge. And I don't even have to use the word racial. It's just bridging divides, period, that we have to think about. And so, I'll leave it at that. We're going to get into more of this as we go along.
I love that you brought up getting out of our comfort zones.
Yeah.
I love that, especially in today's climate and what's happening around the world. In reference to, you brought up dehumanization. I'm thinking about civil discourse as well. And in your book, you talk about and you give examples of how you've given radical empathy to everyone. Can you express how you were able to achieve balance and equanimity or reserve in the midst of conversations that may have been emotionally heightened?
Yeah, and it's a story about getting comfortable with myself first. That's why I always say you have to be comfortable with yourself before you can be comfortable with other people. Because I think a lot of times, when somebody challenges us or we don't agree with them, we take it personally. And you say, oh, this person, it's almost like you feel the person is attacking you. And the reality is, when you tell somebody your opinion, you're not attacking them. You're just saying, this is how I feel about something. And so if you take a step back and say, well, how would I feel if I was saying something to this person that they didn't like? And also, I have what I call my steel core, because, in my 20s, I feel were my years of cognitive dissonance, because I had all kinds of things, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, I should dress this way, I should act this way, I should talk this way, all these different things spinning through my head. And finally, by the time I got to my late 20s, I was like, I just need to be who I am. And, it's interesting because even though my mom, she had some mental health issues, one of the things she did, I feel like she really gifted to me, is this steel core. This understanding that I am who I am, and that's a wonderful thing. And that, it's funny because it connects to this idea of imposter syndrome too, because, when I start to, and, it's an honest feeling, imposter syndrome, but when I start to feel that, if I can tap into who I am and that I like this person, I love this person, loving myself is so important, that has the ability to kind of create this equanimity or this peace that I can say, okay, I don't have to, the way I respond is my responsibility. And so, but the other thing I want to say is that empathy is not absolution. And I have to give credit to my friend, Greg Sattel, who came up with that, because the reality is I am not going to agree with everybody. There are some people I just cannot, countenance. And, and you also have to make sure you're creating boundaries. So, I do my best to show empathy for everybody, up to a certain point. There's certain things and people and situations that I won't put up with. And so there's a real need to make sure that you are creating your own boundaries while making sure you create space for those around you, particularly, people we work with, people in our communities, so on, to try and understand each other. And even if we don't agree or if we don't like what they have to say, we can at least give some effort. And, I think that's what's really lacking. And it's too easy. Social media makes it way too easy to just condemn somebody. And, you don't, because it's not face to face, you don't have to face the consequences. And so I think that we need to get past that and really try to, like you said, get out of our comfort zones.
I just want to promote a couple of things that you said. That thank you so much. I was thinking as you were speaking about what your mother instilled in you in reference to this aspect of self-acceptance. and what it means to be accepting of ourselves. As you were speaking, I was thinking about radical empathy for others. And when you were sharing that, I also thought about the importance of being empathetic with me. So thank you for that wonderful example. I also love that you shared that radical empathy is not necessarily absolute. There is a such thing as boundaries, and it is important for us to be aware of those boundaries. This is not listen, but when you brought up the boundaries, is there any suggestion that you can give in reference to those that may be wondering, how can we be aware of our boundaries?
Well, that's the getting to know yourself aspect of it, right? So I have pretty broad boundaries because, I mean, my first book, Voting Radical Right, I had to talk to, radical right politicians to do that. And so understanding that I was, that doing that was, kind of my objective research, and not that I was condoning or, promoting, what some of these folks were talking about and doing, is one way of talking about boundaries, but it's also kind of your emotional boundaries. So, I can certainly in this work, I get to a point where I need a break, and I'm kind of at that point now. I'm heading off to California tomorrow and then off to Puerto Rico next week. So it's not just about boundaries. It's knowing when your cup is full and taking some time or your cup is empty, I should say, depending on how you look at it. And you need to replenish. And so part of it is understanding that when do I need to be replenished, and what do I do to be replenished? And so it's like I said, it's kind of trial and error. And I've had a lot of experience over the years. I've been in leadership positions at different universities, and and just being in a discipline. I'm a political scientist that doesn't have a lot of diversity. It's building, but still has a ways to go. And so, my generation in my discipline, we're those of us who are women and minorities are kind of at the forefront of change. And so we're constantly being the first to do, something, and so it's that finding that balance in trying to know when you can put that extra bit of energy into something and when you can't.
Absolutely. You brought up the universities. When we consider academia and higher education and radical empathy, are there any other aspects that you see that we should be pushing forward just a little bit more than what we're doing?
Yes, I can come up with a few. The first is accountability, and making sure every single one of us is accountable and knows we have responsibility. That's why I wrote this book. I was like, why, we've had diversity efforts for years and years and years, and why aren't we moving the needle? The percentage of Black faculty more broadly in the US hasn't shifted much. It's like maybe 0.1% in the last 20 years. And why is that? It's because department chairs aren't taking responsibility. Deans aren't taking responsibility. Program directors aren't taking responsibility. The people, in higher ed, the people who are responsible for hiring are, it's at the level usually of the faculty or the department. And every single one of us has, every single faculty member who's doing the interviewing has to be willing to take responsibility. And I know in a lot of places, including here at McGill, we do training for search committees. But we actually had to go the extra step of creating what we call provostial delegates to be on those committees. And those are people who are designated by the provost from outside of the department who sit there and say, no, you cannot switch out this white male for this in a search that's meant to hire a Black candidate. So that's the kind of things we have to do. I mean, it's because it's funny because we often think of accountability as being self-accountability, the leadership has to say, how do we create accountability? And you create accountability by putting in systems that are going to ensure that you get the outcomes that you want. And so that's one of the reasons I was willing to come to McGill, is they had a clear strategy. They were taking steps to ensure that it was going to be possible to do it. In the last 2 years, we've hired over 20 Black faculty.
That is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
You said past few years?
Yeah, so in 2019, out of 1,700 faculty, McGill only had 10 Black faculty, not counting lectures. And today we have about 37.
Wonderful.
On the tenure track.
On the tenure track.
Yep.
Wonderful work. Wonderful work.
And we just hired 2 new English professors. So I'm extremely excited about that, because I thought we were only going to get 1 and we got 2. So
this is wonderful work indeed. Wonderful work. I love that.
Let me say one more thing about that, because in the academy, one of the problems with not hiring faculty of color and women is that there are whole areas of research that aren't getting done. When I was studying immigration policy back in the late 1990s, I was one of a handful. I mean, I had a few mentors who back in the 70s and 80s had kind of started in on it, but it didn't become a thing until like 10 years. It's literally 10 years ago, because I just submitted a piece for the 10-year anniversary of the immigration section in the Political Science Association. So we didn't even have a section for immigration until 10 years ago. And we tried to do one 20 years ago, and there weren't enough of us. So imagine that, this is a whole area, and you see how huge the immigration issue is today. And imagine that poli-sci was not covering it. So, and, the radical right, when I did it from the perspective of anti-immigrant politics, so there's all these things that aren't being done and aren't happening, and that's why I wrote my book, The Roots of Racism, as well. So we can understand that the academy is lacking if we do not have diversity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I share your excitement in reference to faculty of color, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about our students. And to your point, our students are yearning for intercultural competence. They are yearning to see faculty in the classroom that looks like them. Representation matters so much. So congratulations again on the wonderful work that you all are doing. And thank you so much for sharing that, because it makes a difference for so many reasons with our students. I know in your book, you talk about overcoming a number of challenges individually and within your family, and how instrumental family was in your development. For some of our students that may not have a strong support system and may not be in a environment that is reflective of some of the support that they could receive, what are some of your thoughts about what these students can do to assist with moving forward?
All right, and this is where I'm going to share my screen again. So hopefully I'll do it right this time. And yeah, there we go. All right, so I wanted to share this picture of me and my family. I'm the youngest of 7. Excuse me. And so I'm the baby in my mom's arms there. And, family is so important, but even my family had dysfunction. My mom had borderline personality disorder. But, I feel like though I still had very strong support in terms of, becoming solid in terms of, knowing what I had to do to succeed, which is, the African-American proverb, you have to work twice as hard to get half the credit, which is why I show this picture on the right of, it's one of these things is not like the other picture. My dad is one Black guy in a group of Air Force guys who are in the non-commissioned officer academy. I didn't discover this picture until a few years ago. But it just struck me how, my dad's experience was, in the 1962. And then to this day, I'm still experiencing walking into rooms where I'm the only woman, or I'm the only Black person, or I'm the only Black woman. And so that really helped me feel a connection to him through the years, and why he said that, why he pushed us so hard and so on. And I have to show off my Stanford running career because, one of the things I talk about is that, in understanding who we are and getting, where we, going from, both of my grandfathers were sharecroppers, one in Georgia, one in Louisiana. My mom is from Louisiana. My dad's father is from Georgia. And for me to end up, at Stanford as a PhD, that was huge. But, I didn't always have the family supports that I needed. And so one of the things I talk a lot about is, and this is something in academia we've started to do a better job of, but we need to do more, is thinking about that first generation student. There's the whole hidden curriculum. There's the, all the things, even from going from undergrad to grad school, all the things I didn't know. And I had so many men, besides, family support, my sisters, I'm very, very close to, maybe not as close to my brothers, but, they're good guys too. And, but, my sisters really were a huge support. I'm the only one who finished college, I should say, and went on to get a PhD. So, it was a source of pride for them. And they always, even a little bit financially when I was in undergrad, were helping me out. So having those connections, and sometimes, I like to talk about chosen family. So we kind of talk about mentors and sponsors, people who help, and I had plenty of those, and I talk about a lot about those. But there's also kind of that chosen family, those friends. I mean, and I still am very close to some of my friends from undergrad and grad school who also were there to help me along. So it's not always just family, although that's really important. It's also that chosen family. It's the people who, are part of our lives in various ways. So I really think it's something that you can reach out to people, but also look at who's paying attention to you. Because I can always say there are people who saw more in me than I saw in myself, which helped me along the way. The track coach who called up the Stanford track coach and said, you need to check this girl out, the professor who said, hey, I didn't do it, but he said, oh, you should consider the presidential scholars program, things like that I didn't even know existed. And so one of the things we can do as faculty is remember that our students don't always know what's out there and what resources, even my own son who's, going through college right now, I have to remind him, that there are opportunities and things out there, and that even if you're not a first generation student, sometimes you don't know, the ways that you can get help and support. And so as faculty, as leaders in higher ed, we need to make sure we're looking out for our students, and also making sure that we encourage that peer-to-peer support.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I love that phrase that you used, chosen family. I love that. Mm-hmm. And in reference to you were talking about our city, Pittsburgh, and some of the ties that you have here. And you talk a lot about the importance of immigration in your book as well. In reference to the city of Pittsburgh and some of the immigration history here, and even on our campus here at Duquesne University, would you mind sharing some of the parallels that you've seen or that you may have noticed in reference to the city and the importance of immigration?
Yeah, so obviously Pittsburgh has a very rich history of immigration. And, what's interesting about it, I've studied pretty closely the history of immigration in the US and Europe. And, and the reason my book, Roots of Racism, looks at that, the way that they're intertwined is that if you think about the history of immigration and the fact that, the first group, because African Americans, of course, were enslaved and brought over here, one of the first groups that was, they put, made it illegal for them to come to the US was Chinese, and then Asians more generally. And so that's why we see larger immigrant populations that have come from Europe, and only more recently. So it's kind of this divide between, long-term immigrants who came, in the early 1900s, and those who came more recently, and even between, Africans who've come more recently and African Americans who were enslaved. And so, I think there are some interesting generational parallels. But one of the things that really stands out is that even though there are immigrant groups who are discriminated against, and often, for immigrants of color, they come here and it's the first time they've experienced discrimination. They may have grown up in Africa or in the Caribbean or in Latin America, and they come to the U.S. and all of a sudden it's like, wait, you're Black and we're going to treat you a certain way. I've been having this discussion a lot because this is a big issue here in Canada. And so I think one of the ways we can look at it is that there's these processes we all go through as groups. And so if some of the groups who've been here longer could remember that there was a time, when the Irish, when the Italians, when, Southern Europeans more generally, and Eastern Europeans were limited in their ability to come to the US because they were racialized. We have this long history of racialization. And one of the things that I think is, if we can think about, having empathy and understanding that those are processes, right? The ways that we become, in some ways assimilated, and, even learning the language and so on. And unfortunately, there's this persistent bias against, Black people, and that is an ongoing thing. And so that immigrants who come here hopefully can learn to have some empathy and understand the history and the ways that these processes work. And it's not just that people need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. The bootstraps don't exist for so many, and never have existed, and actually are actively cut under them. So it's there are some generational parallels, but there are also things that are kind of constants. And I've seen this in survey data, even in there's like hierarchies. There's two books by Isabel Wilkerson that I love. Actually, I really love The Warmth of Other Suns greatly because it's such a great book. I won't talk about it right now because we don't have time. But the other one is Caste. And if we can understand these things from the perspective of how it's systemic, right? We have to understand how systemic racism impacts both immigrants and African Americans and other groups. And, being in Texas for so long and California, the Latino community, and it's a very disparate and non-homogeneous community. And yet, there are all these biases that they have to deal with as well. So it's very complicated, but I think empathy can really help to again, bridge those divides.
Absolutely. And once again, thank you for everything that you've shared in reference to bridging those divides. And from the aspect of the systemic aspect that you discussed, how it's layered, how it's complicated, from discrimination, from prejudice to microaggressions to racial battle fatigue within itself. When we think about our leaders, and I know you talked a lot about accountability earlier. When we consider bridging that gap and training leaders within the academic profession and higher education, do any other thoughts come to mind in reference to, as you just pointed out, how we navigate changing this system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of creating change, leaders need to be willing to be vulnerable, because we have to be willing to look at our systems and look at how we run things and say, gee, if anybody ever says to me, we've always done it this way, I'm usually going to say, well, then it's time to change. Because when you do things the same way, you get the same outcomes. And then you wonder, why are we getting different outcomes? And, we really have to be open to constantly, it's funny because I think a lot about, I've been through so many strategic planning exercises, and one thing that drives me crazy about them is that this is a process. It's an ongoing thing. It's not, you can't have a strategic, the 9 out of 10 strategic plans sit on a desk, they're this thick and they sit on somebody's desk. The reality is we need to have different types of processes that allow us to constantly be updating our priors. There's things we talk about. I'm thinking of the way we approach it in political science, but there's ways we can say, okay, this is an ongoing process. Where are we at now? Where do we want to be, in a month, in a year? Have short-term, middle-term, long-term goals, and then constantly be coming back to those and saying, okay, where are we at now? We do an annual report for our strategy to address anti-Black racism at McGill, but I'm also constantly thinking about where are we at? How many new faculty have we hired? What are we doing about retention? How are we connecting students with the courses these new faculty are teaching? All these different things. And so one of the things I'm going to do before I head off on vacation is just do a SWOT analysis and think about what are really, I'm mostly concerned about the threats. What are some of the things that may keep us from getting to our goals? And what are some of the problems we might run into as we try to retain faculty? Because it's great that we've got 37 faculty, but if we don't keep them, where do we go? But also, I always want to be students first. And so that's really important to keep our students need it right there directly in front of us at all times.
Thank you so much. That aspect of creating that sense of diversity and equity, but also the inclusion, being able to ensure that people of color, students, faculty, administration feel safe as well. Thank you for that. I just want to add that for those that are with us live, the question and answer section is open. You can submit your questions to the question and answer section. Please do not use the chat because the chat is not available. We do have one question that has been presented to us thus far, Terry, and at this time, I think I'll go to this question. We have a question from Sarah Barron, I believe. And the question is, Terri, I love your comments about fond family. Can you talk a little bit more about how important fond families are for both students and faculty empathy?
So it comes back to this concept of belonging. And belonging is so important. And we have to act in an inclusive way in order to create belonging. We need inclusive leaders. We need to be inclusive in the way we do things. And so that found family, when we think about, especially, I think it works even better with undergraduates who are new to an institution. But, even when you're in graduate school, actually, to be honest, for me, they were both critically important, having that found family in undergrad and then having that found family in graduate school, because it's a means of, connecting to people in ways that we might not otherwise. And I think the way to try to get there is to create opportunities. So we often don't think about creating opportunities for students to connect outside of the classroom. What we're doing today at McGill is having a end of Black History Month gathering for the community, for everybody to come and just, and we just opened a Black student space so that our Black students have a place they can come to and have their meetings and connect and, invite faculty to come and talk to them. And so oftentimes our role as faculty and leadership is to create those opportunities so that students can make those connections.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And a question that I have before I, okay, here we have another question.
Can I ask a question? Hi, Dr. Givens. My name is Kaya Shivers, and I am a professor at NYU. I have a question about radical empathy. I read a chapter, and in this portion of the chapter, you were talking about how you were going to UCLA, or were you teaching at UCLA?
Oh, no, I was in the PhD program.
And it was about 1993. So this was a year after the LA civil unrest. It resonates with me because I'm from LA. So I was a high schooler at the time. And living or teaching in the New York area and living in the New York area, I was a professor during the Clinton-Trump presidential elections, the Obama elections, and as well now the pandemic. What happened is that the politics in the streets leaked into the classroom. So this is a pedagogical question, and maybe for those who are professors. And so I don't know if it's because of me being a Black woman in the position and space that I am in, but I could not teach. I teach journalism and I teach, writing and food sustainability, but I could not teach those classes without addressing what the students were protesting about in Washington Square Park. So the question is that, one, how did your pedagogical approach change after the pandemic? Because it became so intimate, everybody's on Zoom. Or maybe if you can address, what does your pedagogy look like when you are representing an underrepresented group and you feel compelled to talk about these pressing crises that are going on?
Thanks so much for that question. That's a great question because I really addressed this last year when I wasn't teaching right after George Floyd, but I was last year, and I was teaching classes, my comparative immigration politics class, and then the roots of racism, one semester. So the way I approached it is that first of all, we had ground rules for discussion, and actually, I worked through those with the students. And so the first class was designed just because, especially the roots of racism course, because I knew this was a difficult topic. And I said, here's the ground rules for discussion. And you guys, we want to have respect for each other. We want to be able to, be open to each other's opinions, et cetera. So they had some responsibility for providing feedback and input into those difficult conversation ground rules. And secondly, I gave them various ways to respond. So it was a class discussion, but not everybody feels comfortable opening up in class. And so I gave them the option to talk in class. They could also post to an online discussion, and they could also just write to me directly. And in giving them those three outlets, it gave them, even students who may have felt uncomfortable speaking up in class or felt like the direction that the conversation was going was not the way they felt, they could still come and write something to me that let them express themselves directly. So I think those are the kinds of things we can do. Is first of all to have it's important to talk about these things while they're happening, right? Our students are being impacted, and having some empathy for the fact that our students are being impacted. And sometimes students just want to be seen and acknowledge that they're experiencing these things. And that's the first step, is making sure the students know, I'm not going to ignore this because I'm a researcher and I'm only going to be objective about things. I'm being impacted by this too. And so I have to be able, I was actually doing a radical empathy. It wasn't with students, but it was kind of because I was doing a radical empathy workshop right after the January 6th event. And I just opened up the space for everybody to share their feelings because it was hard for all of us. And I said, you know what, we're going to toss the workshop I had for today, and we're just going to talk and let people share their feelings. And that was really, really powerful. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you, Dr. Shivers, for that wonderful question. I think now we have a couple of more questions from the question and answer portal. I also see a hand up by our Chief Diversity Officer, Crystal McCormick, where now what we're going to do at this point, we're going to
I can wait.
No, we're going to transition over to our panelists. And what we're going to do is give Terri a bit of a break. And then once we are finished with our panelists, we will return to the Q&A questions that we have within our box. Crystal McCormick, where would you like to speak this time?
So I do have one question, Terri. I noticed that you have 6 points for to be to implement radical empathy. And there are also 6 points to become an inclusive leader.
Yeah.
As a leader, what can they do to infuse radical empathy to be a more effective leader and to be a more inclusive leader, in your opinion?
Right. So there's a variety of ways. I mean, it starts with humility, which I believe Dean Barton mentioned at the beginning. So because without humility, it's hard. You have to be open to basically lifelong learning, right? And even though you're in a leadership position, we're all always learning. Being willing to acknowledge mistakes, and being vulnerable in that way. You know, being collaborative and making sure you're working with the key, not just key stakeholders, but one of the things we often run into is the fact that we have people on our teams who may be introverts or don't speak up. And so you have to find, just like I did with my students, we have to find ways of giving people different opportunities for collaboration. We may be sitting in a meeting and you can see somebody has, bells going off, or they have, it takes them a couple of days before they think of a good response to a discussion. And so sometimes you need to go back to somebody a couple of days later and say, hey, did you have any further thoughts on this? Or, hey, I saw you didn't get a chance to speak up during the meeting. Do you want to talk about it one-on-one? Or send an email and say, hey, if anybody has any follow-up to what we discussed at today's meeting. So give people different avenues for collaboration, for providing input, and then have enough humility and vulnerability to be willing to accept feedback and criticism. That it's really hard to do that at times, I know, but it's also important so that we can grow as leaders as well. So those are what I think are some of the key points.
Thank you.
And at this point, we're going to transition over to some of our panel members that we have here today. We have a few questions for them as well. And this first question is going to be addressed to Dr. Okwesi Opukudakwa, who is Professor of Management here at Duquesne University, and also Associate Dean Dr. Kim Nair, who is Associate Dean of the Cornell Law Library. This first question, and Associate Dean Nair, if you're okay with taking this question first, that would be great. This first question just simply states, radical empathy encourages all of us to actively consider another person's point of view in order to connect more deeply with them. Could you share with us an example from your professional life and how it impacted you?
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say, first of all, I don't have a PhD, so just Kim is fine. I would love to be able to adopt the name doctor, but it'll be some years yet, I think. I have many different ways to answer this question. I'll try to think of one. And really, first of all, I just want to say how grateful I am and honored I am to be included in this panel. I think the answer that I'll speak about, I was inspired by the vulnerability that Dr. Givens exercised throughout the book. I really enjoyed reading that. And I'll try to follow that lead in this answer. I'll share a story with really minimal details, obviously, from an early experience when I shifted into leadership and management. And I also just want to say that reading Dr. Givens' book, I'm also really recognizing the reality, or at least probability, of internalized oppression within myself and also within others that I know and work with. And I have to acknowledge my own insecurities and, imposter syndrome. Much more strongly earlier in my career, but definitely still so now as a first gen. And as Dr. Givens has pointed out in her book and describing for herself, the first this and the first that in so many contexts has been deeply a part of my story as well, and continues to be. The answer that I wanted to speak about is related to an early management challenge that I experienced at the time from a very self-focused perspective, to be honest with you. I focused on how the person, my first direct report, who was a professional, how that person's behavior and communications, the content and manner of their communications with me I focused on how it affected me. I focused on, what I felt that this person was doing to me, rather than thinking about the thing situationally, thinking about the experience from the other person's perspective. I took a pause and I had to step back, absorb the person's written and verbal statements, absorb what I had known about them previously, and had some, softer sort of, not off the record, but just less unofficial, more informal conversations with them to recognize that person's perspective, their life situation, and what was leading to the particular behavior, and what I could do and what we could do together to make the work environment and the experience better for both of us and also for our organization. Some years later, we connected again and spoke about how each of us had been looking at the situation only through the lens of our own perspective. And after taking time to step into the other's shoes and recognize the challenges that each other was facing, to understand what each other was experiencing at the time, the connection between us actually became stronger. I think I became better at my job. That person became happier. And we each realized that we had ourselves become stronger through that experience. So, I think I'm not sure if that's a full answer to your question. As I said, I have many more notes that I can give you on this particular topic.
That was wonderful. And thank you so much. Kwasi, would you like to share?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I teach the required business ethics course in the business school. And my topic is quite similar, I think, to Kim's. She was talking about her relationship with a direct report. Mine is a similar situation in terms of learning about my students when I first came to Duquesne in 2016. So specifically, I wanted to talk about the role that emotions play in facilitating quality listening and empathy, in particular focusing on emotions of insecurity, which Kim also talked about, and curiosity. So I came here, I'm an immigrant to the US, I'm from Ghana originally, came here from Rutgers in 2016. And it was quite a transition for me because I found the Duquesne students to be in some ways more homogenous than the Rutgers students. And this, I felt, made it more challenging for me to engage them. And just an illustrative example is, as I teach business ethics, I have an exercise that I use to illustrate cultural differences and moral values. And I start off by asking students if any of them have a moral issue with eating plants. And usually no one has a moral issue with that. And then I would ask them if they have a moral issue with eating beef. And when I was at Rutgers, a fair number of people would stand up who might be vegetarians or Hindus or something like this. At Duquesne, no one would stand up. And then I say, does anyone have an issue with eating pork? And again, at Rutgers, some Jewish people would stand up, some Muslims would stand up, some students from the Middle East. At Duquesne, nobody would stand up. And then I ask if anyone has an issue with eating dogs. And then at Duquesne, pretty much everyone would stand up. So, I think it's a great illustration of the different kinds of diversity, one might be talking about. So this sort of thing went on throughout the semester, and I felt like I wasn't connecting with the students. And in hindsight, well, even at the time, I realized that I had this response, which was I sort of started being much more business-like in class. I would even call it transactional. Like I show up and I say, okay, this is what we're here to do today. Let's do it. And it was almost like, in hindsight, almost petty, right? It's like, okay, if you won't talk to me, let's just focus on the business at hand. So I taught like that. And at the end of the semester, I was expecting to receive 4 RCS evaluations, at least compared to what I was aiming for. And then they were decent. And the students said, I really enjoyed your class. So I realized there was something going on, that I had this expectation that they would show their engagement in a certain way. And they were not showing it that way. Around the same time, I took a course with the Center for Teaching Excellence here on the role of emotions in learning. And I think this also further highlighted to me the way that I was going into class with this transactional approach, which might be viewed as cold and intimidating. And I realized that that was coming from me feeling insecure as a teacher. Like I wasn't getting the interaction I wanted. And so I was making these compensating changes. And then, COVID hit and empathy became very important. And between all this, I really started focusing on trying to be more empathetic and more approachable. And I realized that there could be several things at play. Some was the student demographics, but some was also that it was 2016. So for the first time, I might be teaching one of the first cohorts of the post-millennials. And the statistics say, they prefer nonverbal communication a lot of the time. As Terri noted, sometimes you have to create opportunities for them to give you offline communication. So I started implementing some of those things. But what all of this made stand out for me was the idea that, to be an empathetic teacher, it's really important and to be aware of how insecurity drives the way you actually prevents you from being able to hear other people. And the flip side of that for me is having an attitude of curiosity. And there's a quote that I heard around the same time that has really helped me, that everyone you meet is doing the best they can. And I sort of started using that as an intentional practice before I go into class and when I respond to emails from students and such. So, student misses class, you assume they're doing the best they can. They hand in a really poor assignment, you assume they're doing the best they can. And it allowed me to be more curious about what's going on with you. And students started opening up to me in ways that they hadn't before, which was very helpful to me because I actually realized I was quite privileged in terms of, I'm a second generation college student. I have a stable family. I always had enough financial aid when I was a student. So I don't deal with a lot of the struggles that some of the students here do. So that was really the key takeout for me, is the importance of curiosity and being aware of my own insecurities and how they're affecting my behavior.
Can I just comment? That's a wonderful thing because I often talk about that as well. As having curiosity is so important. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Akwase, and thank you, Kim, for your wonderful answers. For our next question, I'm going to turn to our very own one of our students, the president of our Black Law Student Association, Olamide OEI, and also I'm going to turn to Dr. Donna Nexu, who was influential in bringing us here all together today. And Olamide, you can take this question first if you would like to. People's personal experience is unique and differs from others in reference to race, gender, culture, sexual orientation. Could you share with us an experience and how it impacted you personally and professionally in reference to being unique?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel. And even reading the excerpt that we were sent, I identified so much with everything that, pretty much almost everything that Dr. Givens wrote in her book. And as I sat and thought about all my life experiences, I mean, I can't narrow it down to just one. I am Nigerian, but I'm first generation, born and raised in the United States. My dad came for undergrad, married my mom, and they established their roots here in the United States. So even though I was born here, I also went through so many different challenges trying to figure out where I belonged. This started from elementary school. I was often called Oreo because my African-American classmates, they felt that I talked white. I don't know what that means, but they said I talked white. So I was called Oreo. And then I moved to like my maybe white classmates who were a lot nicer to me, which is always so interesting when I, tell people that it was the people that didn't look like me that actually treated me better than people that actually looked like me. And I think that speaks volumes in so many ways. But my white classmates, it was more from maybe a place of curiosity or even just maybe ignorance, because they don't have the same shared life experiences as myself. So I found myself in a lot of situations trying to figure out where I fit in, who I was, because also among the Nigerian community, I also didn't fit in. My siblings and I didn't fit in because they would say that we weren't born in Nigeria, so we didn't have the same experiences as them. So I just kind of felt like I was just up in the air, like in limbo. And it wasn't until high school that for the first time I felt like my culture was celebrated. I was fortunate to go to a Montessori high school. And I remember during lunchtime, I would jump from table to table. Like they always knew Olamide never sat at just one table during lunchtime. I was with the skaters. I was with the like African Americans. I was with all my white friends. I literally bounced everywhere. But it was because of me doing that it opened me up to so many experiences that people have. And even hearing people talk, it helped me understand that, okay, maybe something like what this person said in class isn't because they're just like, purposely trying to be ignorant, but it's maybe just because they don't know. Like they literally just told me what they experienced. So I feel like it was from there that I started opening myself up more to everyone's various backgrounds. And I started kind of like coming into who I was. And it wasn't even so much who I was, but even who I am unapologetically. Like not letting society, not letting my classmates or anything define me defining myself for myself, and it is only for myself. So then moving on to college, I went to the Ohio State University, and I had a lot of the same experiences where maybe I was the only Black person in the room. I majored in international studies with a focus in relations and diplomacy, and I was a poli-sci minor. So in a lot of those classrooms, I was the only Black person, and talking about like Somalia and talking about like, Europe and all like maybe like the model, like the African Union or the EU, like the UN, talking about all those, establishments that are really in our world to bring unity and to talk about strife and the different experiences. It was interesting hearing other people's experiences, but also me speaking up and being like, no, just because this is how something has been done does not mean that it's right or that there can't be change. And sometimes the change isn't taking something that's negative to be better. Sometimes it's taking something that's good to be better. So also understanding that it doesn't always have to be negative. And also in college, like I was very involved in our African Youth League. And I realized that that was also a time from elementary school where I also felt the divide between at least like my like African Americans, that I feel like I can speak more towards like the African Americans and the African divide, because there is a divide and a lot of people are not aware of that. But I know on eBoard that I really pushed to bridge that gap. Let's have conversations. Let's figure out why the African Americans stay with themselves, why the Africans stay with themselves. Why do we gravitate towards people that I guess have more similar backgrounds, but realizing that we're so much more alike than we realize. So we had a lot of conversations, which further helped me to maybe get rid of some inherent biases that I had. And we were able to do a lot more like collaborative efforts and whatnot. So that has also spilled into law school, which has also spilled into my summer. My summer's working at the law firm where I'll be working. So there's just a lot. Like I wasn't able to narrow it down to one experience. So I just wanted to kind of talk about my experiences from elementary school up until law school. And I think the most important takeaway was me realizing who I am, and then also letting that kind of drive even how I represent clients, like even in clinic and whatnot, like getting rid of those boxes and those borders that we have, so that the ultimate goal is to best represent our clients for who they are, but not based off of race, off of gender and all of that and all our biases. The goal is to represent them as best as possible.
Well said, Alameda. Well said. Donna, would you like to share?
I would love to share, although this is quite a challenging moment following Olamide. But what I really love from all our panelists is this desire to overcome labels. And I think I've been very fortunate that during my entire life, I didn't have to label myself in any way. So it came to a very emotional experience when I started receiving these questions quite often. Where are you from? Where are you from? Suddenly, when I'm from here. I'm here with you, so I'm from here. And what I think irritated me even more, that I was irritated. And I started thinking exactly as Kim mentioned earlier, and Terri, trying to go and as Akwase said about emotions. What was this? And instead of being irritated, I was able to understand, no, that was a particular type of acknowledging difference. And not only acknowledging, but being willing to include. So I try to make every single moment when I'm asked, where are you from? And to a teaching moment, and celebrate diversity and cultural diversity. So now I'm waiting not for the other shoe to drop, but I welcome as a starting point in a conversation, where are you from? So do please ask me where I am from. I'm from here, but I have so much more to tell you. So thank you for.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we have about 10 more minutes of panel time. And at this point in time, I would like to invite two more of our panelists to have an opportunity to speak. Dr. Kaya Shivers, NYU liberal arts professor, who's with us, and Dr. N. Edwards, who's the assistant vice president for student well-being here at Duquesne University. This final panelist question just simply states, we can better appreciate each other by becoming better listeners, so that we each learn from each other's life story. Looking at your professional life, can you share a transformative moment which you believe is caused by your ability to listen to someone else's experience? And Dr. Shivers, if you would like to go first, I welcome you to the floor.
Thank you so much. I actually had something prepared, but in conversation, I'm going to kind of switch it up to personalize this. My mother is from Louisiana. My father's from Mississippi. And I'm the last year of the Great Migration. My parents moved following the Louisianian migration. A lot of people don't know that people from the South actually had migratory routes. My father from Mississippi, his people went to Detroit, Chicago, and Ohio, but we followed our mother. So we went to California. So I have a lot of family in Southern California. Dr. Givens is shaking her head. She understands that very clearly. It's very important to reference this. But my grandmother's first language was Creole. And the last 6 months of her living, she only spoke Louisiana Creole. Nobody in the household could speak Louisiana Creole because it was that archaic. My mother, who was a French teacher, couldn't even understand my grandmother because it was that archaic. So I grew up in a household that was multilingual. I also grew up in a household that was diasporic. We were very clear about having roots. Excuse me, I'm at a conference, so excuse the background noise. So we're very clear about having roots in Africa, indigenous roots, Latin roots, European roots. And so a lot of things that Dr. Givens talked about in her book, going to school, that Olamide talks about, being, the way in which, whites speak and all these different things. I understand that a lot, but I would say the point I want to talk about is when I moved to the East Coast, from Los Angeles, from California, and in education and being in an area where you had a stronger representation of international Black folk, and being told that as an African American I had no culture, and being in these, and then also, and this is not just in personal spaces, but in professional spaces, in academic spaces, and then being an academic and then coming up against these in the academic spaces where there are these instances where it's very much implied that there's more comfortability with a certain Black person in the room versus another Black person in the room, because I'm going to articulate politically, intellectually, a very specific lens that makes, I think, a lot of people who are in the dominant culture very uncomfortable, for a lot of reasons that we don't have a lot of time. So for me, my point came a lot, I would say, and I said this with Dr. Givens during the pandemic. It was a very intimate moment for me as a professor. People were viewing literally into my home, and we were having these discussions that we normally would not have. And so I had to, I'm from a very stoic family, and there's a public self that you are taught and trained. Dr. Givens talks about this, a public self that you present, this respectability that's totally wrapped around it, that I had to relinquish because I had to hold on to my humanity. I had to capture this aspect of my humanity in order for me to have some level of mental health at the end of the pandemic. And so with that, I began to have these very, very, very honest discussions with my students and also people in my department of, I don't like the way that this is done. I disagree. I'm ignorant. At the same time, I didn't know that. I'm so sorry. I thought about this. Also bringing issues of class in, also bringing issues of gender in, intersectionality. And so I just wanted to, earmark that. It's really important. And so from there on, I'm very intentional now just to talk about, because in these academic spaces, it can erase you and you can allow yourself to be erased. And so I'm very intentional about bringing as much as my true self every time I'm step on campus, as opposed to that representation that I've been trained to be. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shivers. Dr. N. Edwards, would you like to step in now?
I sure would. Thank you, Quincy, and thank you, Dr. Givens, for that powerful presentation. In listening to everyone speak and also reading the chapter, that selection from Dr. Givens' book, one of the things that I think of is the German word for empathy is Einfühlung, which is feeling into or in feeling. So what I'm going to share with you all is kind of a story about my feeling into an experience of someone else. In the early 2000s, I worked as a sex offender therapist on a gym in Pahokee, Florida. And so I don't know if anybody's familiar with that part of the States. So it was basically a rows of cornfields, miles and miles of cornfields, miles and miles of farming land in the middle of nowhere. And plopped into the middle of nowhere was this juvenile sex offender unit. And it's a level 8 unit, which that means it's close to maximum security being 10. And so I want to tell you about my encounter and my experience with a particular patient that I worked with there. He was an 18-year-old African-American male and file. And so what I noticed about in terms of reading this individual's case history is there was a lot in terms about all of the things that he did to other people in terms of his so-called sex offenses, but there was very little in the way of information about his history. So I became curious. I wondered to myself, well, I wonder why that is. And group therapy was oftentimes on a basketball court surrounded by guards. And so oftentimes what would happen is in the midst of like a heated discussion, students would get pretty irate, they would get very agitated, and they would start throwing chairs and things of that sort. But this student was a target oftentimes. The prison guards were actually very unkind and mean to him. So I saw him one day. He was under a pavilion sitting by himself, which was commonplace for him because he didn't have a lot of friends there. He didn't have a lot of people that he could talk with. So I went down and started talking to him. And what I noticed about him was his gaze. He had a particular gaze that was very violating. He was objectifying you in many ways. And what I learned soon enough was that other people could not stay within his gaze long enough to be able to get a decent history of his lived experience. And so they would often turn away. They often wouldn't stay in his presence. Is it me? I would return his gaze oftentimes with empathy and with compassion because I knew that there was something else there that he wasn't able to verbalize. And he said to me once, he goes, that's the first time that someone didn't appear afraid, that someone didn't seem scared of me and want to find some reason to get up and walk away. And so we started to do this almost every day on the unit. I would go and visit him under the pavilion and we would have informal therapy sessions. I was moved, and it affects my clinical practice to this very day that not only when I work with people that come in with diagnostic labels, regardless of what those labels are, I try to see them as human beings and try to see them as persons and try to meet them where they are without using those labels as a kind of filter. And so just to end, one of the philosophers that I've been very much influenced by is Jiddu Krishnamurti, an Indian philosopher in the 20th century who's impacted me quite a bit. He talks a lot about relationship. He talks a lot about the art of listening. And he said relationship is a way through which we come to know ourselves. And that couldn't be more true for me. And I would pair that with, in relation to radical empathy is a way to feel into that mirror. And so those two things are kind of axiomatic for me in terms of the way not only I conduct my clinical practice, but also how I try to treat others.
And thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists, and especially thank you to you, Dr. Terri.
There were two final questions. We have about a minute or 2 minutes. I can respond. So I just wanted to say that faculty retention is something we often don't think about because we assume we have such great institutions, everybody's going to be happy and wonderful and just stay and stick around. The reality is we have to create community. We have to create a sense of belonging. We have to provide connections for our faculty to know that they are really a part of us. So it's, again, there's a hidden curriculum around onboarding, everything from grading to all these different things. So it's really critical that you have those orientations, connect new faculty, make sure that you keep checking, department chairs and others are checking in on them regularly. But it's about connecting and making sure those connections stick. So that's a quick answer, but I'm happy. Feel free to check in with me if you want further details on how we're doing it at McGill.
Thank you so much. And to close us out, so McCormick, where would you like to close us out?
Sure. I want to thank everyone for attending today. This has been a labor of love with Dana, myself, and a number of people on this panel. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Dr. Givens, Terri, for your wonderful and powerful presentation. I also want to thank Quincy Stevenson for being a wonderful moderator and thought provoker during the presentation as well. Dean Barton and Dean Barron for your support and co-sponsorship. And I want to thank the panelists because you gave us some very powerful stories that will reinforce how important it is for us to practice radical empathy. At Duquesne University, in my role as CDO, that's my life, infusing radical empathy throughout my work, understanding people's stories, but I wanted to close out with some words that resonated throughout the presentation. Empathy, of course, was mentioned numerous times, connections, leadership, change, comfort zone, being very intentional, to love yourself and to self-accept yourself. Peace, that radical empathy is not an absolution. Establishing boundaries, allowing spaces, effort, intentionality, belonging, inclusiveness, having discussions, collaborative work with everyone, replenishing yourself, accountability, and listening. All of those infuse radical empathy. And we're hoping that moving forward in our work, our everyday mission at Duquesne University, as well as those who are on the panel, we are those change agents. We already know that we are radical in our own way because we advocate through a complete political or social reform. And we want to move forward what we can do to be a more empathetic society. So with that said, I would like to close out the day and welcome everyone again to the world of radical empathy, and also to close out our day to say goodbye. And we're hoping that we can move forward and being the change agents that we are. So thank you very much and take care.